Hello, this is Ryan Ellis. Today I'm in conversation with Mr. David Dudenhoefer. Yes, the dude himself, here in the flesh. Mr. Dudenhoefer has 13 years of experience as a political activist and community organizer, both here in Detroit, Metro Detroit, and in fact statewide throughout the state of Michigan. He is running for the 13th district to be a representative in Congress. I'm just going to ask Mr. Dudenhoefer a couple questions. He's been gracious enough to give me some of his valuable time. Do we forgive student debt?
Well, obviously, we want to encourage people to only spend what they can afford. But of course, the way the system is set up, you're expected to go into debt all the way with it and do your schooling. Whether you come out with a good paying job or not, now you're saddled with that debt. And oftentimes, students are coming right out of their parents' homes and they've never been exposed to debt before. So this is their first experience and we're saddling them with a $25,000, $30,000 debt or more right out of the gate. And so that's burdensome to students, especially if their jobs that they're receiving right out of the gate are not paying as well as they thought they would. So to really solve student debt, I think it's just the approach. It's recognizing that the system is set up today so that we're encouraging enrollment. And that's beneficial to the universities and the colleges, but it's not necessarily beneficial to the students. What I think they ought to do is shift the focus to job placement, career placement, and incentivizing good careers. So we could look at different things like competition and lending. Since 2010, the government has a sole monopoly on the student loan program. And at that time, the average debt was somewhere around $20,000, and we were promised that the debt would go down. Instead, it actually increased to somewhere between $30,000 to $37,000. And of course, there's other issues that are involved. It's not just the debt for the college itself. It's living expenses. If they're living outside of the home, if they're living on campus, those are also expenses that have to be taken into account, and then food and what have you. So, but I think one way you could look at it to tackle this is through something called income share agreements, or ISAs. That's something that's being experimented with right now, both with businesses and with the universities themselves. So from a business standpoint, you could invest in the student and agree to pay a percentage of the debt, as long as the student agreed to come work for you for a period of time. So that might encourage the student to make a different choice with a major, and recognize that they would have a place to come and work afterwards, and that part of their debt would be taken care of by the business that they're working for. So another way is that the universities themselves are entering into these agreements with the students. So for example, at Purdue University, they're allowing students to enter into the agreement with them, and depending on what major they take, they would agree to pay a percentage over a period of months that's predetermined. So they could be paying, for let's say 100 months or so, 110, whatever it is, months on a debt. And if they still owe after that time is up, then that debt is forgiven, it's washed away, it's forgotten about, okay? But if they're paying more during that same period of time, that's because they've gotten a better paying job, and at that point they wouldn't really care. So it encourages them to, let's say, go into a math major or something of a business major, as opposed to taking, let's say, gender study or sociology or an art major that may not pay as much, and they may be saddled with a debt that they're paying for an extended period of time. They could also set it up where they're basing the months that you're paying on the major that you decide to go into. So if you went into a major that doesn't pay as much, the university may say, okay, you can pay so much for, let's say, 110 months, but if they go into a major that is going to pay more, they could recognize that that investment is a better investment, and they may conclude that, okay, you're going to pay so much for, let's say, 95 months or 90 months. So it encourages the students to make better choices with their majors. And so it's incentivizing rather than, it's incentivizing for the future rather than worrying about the present. So we're investing in the student's future as opposed to the university's present. And right now the loan program is really unfair because no matter what major you're taking, no matter what your income level, the same lending rules and the same agreements are made to the student, no matter what your background is. So in some ways you could look at it as welfare for the rich, since they would be applying for the same loan under the same conditions. So I just think that there's a different way to approach this, but definitely getting government out of it. Anytime government's involved on an issue such as student loans, quality goes down and the cost goes up, as we've seen with the failed student loan program. The last thing I'll say about student loans is, in this issue, and why it's so important to me, is because the way it's set up now, and the students are being saddled with this debt, it's creating a hotbed for political opportunists to come into the universities and incorrectly blame capitalism and then offer up socialism. And so to me, the dirty seed of socialism really is planted at the universities with young minds that are already burdened with student debt, and then being falsely told that it's because of capitalism, when in fact it's because of government overreach and government involvement that drove the cost up to begin with. So if we solve student debt, I believe we also solve the issue of socialism, which we know is the gateway drug to communism.
Biblically, in the book of Ruth, they would leave a little bit behind the fields for people. You had to work for it, but it was free if you just did the work and got it for yourself. And it's sort of like a pull yourself up by your own bootstraps mentality that, like you said, gets away from maybe the free ride nanny state.
Sure, there was a time when students could go and do a summer job and then be able to pay for their tuition, and they came out with a degree and they weren't saddled with a cumbersome debt. So we have to figure out what were the conditions back in those days and restore those conditions, as opposed to trying to feed into the current conditions, which clearly aren't working either for the economy, for the parents, for the students, really for anybody. It's just a failure for everybody. So we can figure out how to get government out of it, how to make it equitable for the students, no matter what their background is, and so that the opportunities are open for everybody in an equal way. Then the outcomes will be different, because people are seeking different career goals. But if we can create the conditions where the opportunity is good for everybody, then that's win-win for everybody.
Student debt, people are saying, is a bubble akin to the mortgage bubble when we had the Great Recession. With that in mind, how is student debt a different priority than mortgage debt? Mortgage debt just surpassed the number before the 2008 Great Recession this past August. And of course, it hit Detroit harder than anywhere else in America. How are those different, or how are they the same? The mortgage debt problem and the student debt problem?
Debt is debt.
Yeah.
And I was always taught that if you were in debt, you were in the hole. And it didn't matter how you got there. It's not a good situation for anybody. However, I would say with students, it's harder because they're just coming into the world from their parents' homes, or maybe they haven't left their parents' homes, and they're graduating with this exorbitant amount of debt that they find challenging to pay, and they don't have the resources to cover it. So, they're paying for sometimes 20 years or more. I know people personally that went into a career, didn't end up going into that career when they graduated, and 10 years has passed, and they're still paying on that debt, even though they didn't get into that career field. So it's tough for them, because now they're making stressful decisions as opposed to decisions where they're sort of stable and they can calmly make these decisions. Now they're making rash decisions. Mortgage debt is slightly different, because presumably the people going into the debt have a job, they have some savings behind them. Otherwise, the mortgage company may not loan to them. And there's a bit of more of a net to fall back on. However, life changes. So, people lose their jobs, they get sick, life changes happen, and it can be every bit as stressful. To me, I look at debt as debt, regardless of how it emanates. Just that with the students, it could be a bit more mentally challenging because they're young minds. They're just coming into the world, and now they're saddled with this debt. So that's probably the only difference I would assign to it.
Last question on student debt. Would you look at student debt differently depending on the college, community college versus private or state college, or out-of-state versus in-state? Or is it the same across the board?
I think that the debt burden is the same regardless. The rules might be different from public university to private, but ultimately those choices are made by the students as to what's better for them to attend. And the rules are different, obviously, but either way, debt is debt. And so the idea is that we don't want to saddle people with debt. We really have a kind of a debt-based system that we've created, whether it's student mortgages, car notes, whatever it is. And what I'm just trying to get at is let's change the mindset and get back to spending no more than what you're making. So staying and living within your means is really the goal. And I think a credit-based system is how we've gotten into this hole, and it's stressful on the economy. It's stressful on people socially, and that leads to all sorts of other secondary problems. So solving those issues, I think, would create a more stable society, both economically and socially. And for me, we're not going to solve that by government involvement, because government's gotten involved, and all they've ever done is exacerbated the problem.
Yeah. You wanted to make a comment on student loans?
Some other thoughts on student debt. I mean, obviously, if you can offer tax breaks and, what have you to alleviate that, then you offer that. But I know that there is proposed legislations, at least in the Senate, that's dealing with the idea that we could take a portion of people's 401 or pre-taxed money and apply that to student debt. So it gives families the option to get pre-tax dollars and use that to pay off burdensome debt. Those are ideas that we can implement as well. I'm just trying to get away from the escalating debt itself. But there's some great ideas already out there that I would be supportive of. And, in terms of how you would pay for college, you pay for it the same way that you pay for cell phones or computers. And so, I think that, we have to come up with creative solutions and not allow the government to take over an entire sector and, saddle people with the kind of debt that they're being saddled with. As I said before, banks haven't been in the student loan business since 2010. And what's really disturbing is that there's some members of Congress that don't know that. They think that the banks are still
I remember.
they're still doing So and that's another example of the type of representation that we just really don't need in Congress. You have people that are great campaigners. They are great at raising money, but when they get there, they're not aware of certain things that they ought to be aware of, and that's not helping the problem. So I just wanted to add those two things, because if you think about debt and you think about student debt, or any issue for that matter, but the government, if in the private sector, if you were to have Homeland Security, be in charge of finding one company to produce cell phones, and if the government was in charge of that, we would still be walking around with those big box phones with the cords and paying $1,000. But competition has allowed cell phones and computers and what have you to become more innovative. Costs have gone down, quality's gone up.
Yeah.
And so I just think that you could apply that with different sectors such as student debt, and you would find that the cost would come down.
Sounds like you might be a proponent of privatization of a lot of things.
I think that in the private sector, we're encouraged to find solutions that are cost-effective and efficient. Government's not there to be efficient or effective because they can always dip into the endless well of the taxpayers when they find that they're failing at what they're doing, and they're a bureaucracy anyway. So you really need to handle much of this at the private level, in the private sector, I should say. And I think that when we do that, and when we determine that we want to be more of a society that's more focused on wealth and productivity as opposed to debt monetization and focusing on service jobs. I mean, obviously we have to have service jobs, but I mean, we've become more of a consumer. They tell us a consumer-based economy. Well, try to explain that to a farmer. The farmer knows that if he doesn't produce or she doesn't produce, they don't eat.
Yeah.
So that whole idea is ridiculous, and it needs to be shot down, and we need to recognize that getting back to being productive, getting back to finding free market solutions, meaning I would call it people market solutions. What that means is that the people are in charge of figuring out, identifying a problem and then figuring out the solution, as opposed to relying upon government. Government can do certain things, but government is limited to, obviously, the enumerated privileges that we've granted them, and anytime government steps past those, we find that there are unintended consequences, and oftentimes they're having to create more legislation to sort of counter the ill effects of previous legislation or previous laws that were enacted, and the damage that they've done with those government overreaches. So what I'm just simply advocating for is getting back to basics, getting back to a constitutional form of governance, restricting the government to its enumerated privileges that we the people have granted them, encouraging personal responsibility, but allowing people to keep the fruit of their labor so that they can make those decisions. When we steal from people, and I do believe taxation is theft.
Yes.
When we steal from people's labor, when we punish their savings, we're creating a society that's more reliant upon government and more susceptible to government's whims. So it's a multi-layer approach that I'm going for. Some of it's achievable in the short term. Some of it's probably going to take some time. But if we don't start now, if we don't start here, we're never going to get there. And the boom and bust cycle will continue. The debt will increase. The burdens on society will get worse. The middle class will continue to get wiped out. And more people are going to become reliant upon an ever-growing government, and that's not conducive to a free society. That's conducive to a society that we were not meant to be.